for attending our webinar. My name is Basma Majerbi. I'm an associate professor at University of Victoria, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this webinar on behalf of Faculty for Palestine, UVic. We are a network of faculty who supports the cause of Palestinian liberation, and we understand that the struggle of Palestinian freedom is aligned with struggles for justice, equality, and decolonization in many parts of the world. So I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge where I am joining from in Victoria, BC, and invite everyone from wherever you are joining to also reflect on the land that we are in, to recognize that we are meeting on indigenous territories. Our concern for the topic of today around colonial settler practices and all these conflicts that are a result of this kind of colonial occupation and oppression are deeply connected again with this struggle. In my case, I'm joining from Lekwungen traditional territory, and I would like to take a moment to recognize that and renew our commitment here at University of Victoria to Indigenous reconciliation. So without further ado, I would like to introduce my colleague, Tim Richard, who is kindly accepted to moderate this webinar. Tim is a member of the Faculty of Law. His background is in legal advocacy with a focus on anti-poverty advocacy. And Tim, the floor is yours. So thank you very much for moderating the session.
Thank you, Basma, and thank you for that introduction to our session today, which is entitled A Turning Point or More of the Same, the ICJ Advisory Opinion on Palestine and its Global Impact. So first, a few comments about how the session today will proceed. We will have a brief introduction followed by presentations of 10 minutes each by each of our two panelists today, Asad Kiani and Karen Rodman. We will then follow that with a discussion based upon questions from ourselves and from participants, and then we'll have a conclusion at that point. So many thanks, Asad Kiani and Karen Rodman, for making time to join today with us and to help us think through the consequences of the ICJ Advisory Opinion towards a view of how we can most effectively utilize this ruling in the interest and to the benefit of the Palestinian people and in their struggle for self-determination. Just a few more comments about the process. The Q&A is enabled, so you can access that to provide us with questions that you would like us to take to the panelists. The chat is also open. It won't be available to view by participants, but we will be able to monitor it and post links and so forth. And so if you have questions that you'd like us to take up, please put those in the Q&A, or you could put them in the chat as well. So before I introduce the panelists today, I would like to pause for a few moments for each of us to take time to reflect and connect to what's most important to us about the struggle of the Palestinian people. I think they're fully in our hearts and minds today, and I think each of us has been affected in very profound ways by the genocide that is ongoing in Gaza. So I would like to pause for some moments of silence so that we can all focus our attention on that entirely and to connect with what has been of most impact to each of us with respect to our work on this struggle. Thank you. So we will now proceed to the presentations by our panelists. First presenting will be Asad Kiani. He is a faculty member here at the UVic Faculty of Law. His area of specialization and expertise is international law. This is the area of his graduate research. It's the area of his scholarship, and he has a particular focus and specialization on criminal law. And so, Asad, I will turn it over to you for your comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks, Basma, for the welcome and the introduction. I'm also joining from the territory of the Lekwungen peoples, and of course, it's important to think about the connections between the issues that we're discussing today in Palestine and obviously the issues at home here as well in terms of anti-colonial struggles. I want to start today just by talking a bit about the ICJ decision that came out last month and speaking a little bit about what it is in terms of what kind of decision it is, what kinds of legal consequences it has, and what kinds of legal issues it has opined on or determined, or come close to determining, depending upon your position with such advisory opinions. So let's start by talking about what the ICJ is dealing with in this particular decision. It's a case that was referred to the court, the International Court of Justice, by the General Assembly of the United Nations. And it was referred at the very end of 2022, on December 30th, 2022, the General Assembly passed a resolution that, among other things, and it's a very long resolution, but among many other things, it condemned all violence against Palestinian and Israeli civilians, urged Israel to comply with international law in a variety of ways that would protect Palestinian civilians. And three, it finally asked the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, to offer a legal opinion on two questions. What are the legal consequences of Israel's ongoing violations of the rights of Palestinian peoples and in Palestinian territories? And the effect of those ongoing violations on the legality of Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories and the obligations for all states and the UN that flow from Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories. Now, those are two very big questions, kind of compound questions, but the court took on those questions to try and figure out what the nature of the occupation is and what the legal impact of the occupation is, and in particular, its impact for Israel, members of the United Nations, and the United Nations itself. So the starting point really to take here is that this predates the current war in Gaza. This is about the overall occupation. It's not the case at the International Criminal Court about the responsibility of 3 Palestinian and 2 Israeli officials for their conduct in that war. It's not about genocide. It's simply about the occupation and the presence of Israel in Palestinian territories. The other thing to keep in mind here is that what we're talking about is an advisory opinion. So the International Court of Justice is able to give so-called advisory opinions or decide what are called contentious cases. A contentious case is when 2 or more states agree to have a dispute between them resolved at the court and agree to abide by whatever the court decides. An advisory opinion is different. There's no states that agree to have the dispute settled by the court, and so it's not binding upon those states in the same way. What happens is, in international organization, usually a group or organ of the United Nations asks for a legal opinion, and then it's free to act as it wishes once it's received that legal opinion. At the same time, the court says advisory opinions carry great legal weight and moral authority. They help contribute to the clarification and development of international law. And while they don't directly settle disputes between states, they offer legal advice that is really pertinent to the issues at stake. And so the court suggests that states and UN organizations take care to give the full appropriate weight to advisory opinions. And the court itself tends to follow its past advisory opinions. So the court itself sees what is decided before in terms of legal opinions as really building international law. And the value of doing this from the court's point of view is that it helps promote the stability, the certainty, and the predictability of the international legal system. And it minimizes claims that the court is acting arbitrarily or inconsistently or unfairly, depending upon what issue they're talking about. So there's actually some great strength behind these advisory opinions, even though they're not binding in the same way. They're still authoritative interpretations of international law. So let's talk a little bit about the issues around this particular case. The first thing I want to address is whether there's anything unusual about the ICJ taking on the case. The short answer is no. The court doesn't get many requests for advisory opinions sent to it, including this one. It's only given out 5 advisory opinions in the last 20 years. Of those 5, 4 referred to it by the General Assembly, and each of those 4 were decisions that in one way or another concerned a right to self-determination. This is the case around the legality of the separation wall built by Israel in the occupied West Bank in 2004, the legality of Kosovo's unilateral declaration of independence in 2010, the legal consequences of the United Kingdom's separation of the Chagos archipelago from Mauritius, so another colonial scenario, and the present case. So in each one of these cases, the court is saying we're going to take on cases that deal with self-determination. And so it would have been unusual for the court to refuse to hear the case in this situation, given that previously it's been very happy to take on advisory opinions concerning the legality of self-determination or decolonization or occupation. It's also not weird that the court has said that it has jurisdiction and said that it has it even though that there is some kind of dispute underlying this. States often object to the court assuming jurisdiction over a case because they say it's a political issue, not a legal issue, but the court has always said consistently, going back decades, that a legal dispute is something that you can offer a legal opinion on, and that usually the legal opinion will help support the political process. So it sees them as 2 separate but parallel issues, and the fact that there's some political disagreement doesn't stop the court from taking on this case in a legal sense, offering some opinions on the law that's relevant. Okay, having introduced that case, let's talk a little bit about some of the big conclusions from there. So the first is, the court makes a pretty strong argument that it's not just the West Bank and East Jerusalem that are occupied, but that Gaza is also occupied by Israel. Saying that the West Bank and East Jerusalem are occupied is pretty uncontroversial in international law. Most international lawyers agree that they have been occupied for 57 plus years, or about 57 years now. But the debate has really been about whether the Gaza Strip is also occupied. For most international lawyers, when you think about occupation, what you think about is having feet on the ground and occupying army in the place. But Gaza, saw a withdrawal of Israeli troops in 2005 and of settlers in 2005. So there was some confusion as to whether Gaza could still be seen as occupied. The way in which the court understood this is that since Israel withdrew but remained capable of exercising and continued to exercise certain key elements of authority over the Gaza Strip, including control of the land, sea, and air borders, restrictions on movement of people and goods, collection of import and export taxes, and military control over a buffer zone that is, a kind of strip of land between the Gaza Strip and Israel, that it could still be seen as having some degree of effective control over the Gaza Strip. And so Gaza isn't occupied in the same way most occupied territories are occupied, but Israel still has obligations under the law of occupation because of the kinds of control that it exercises over so many aspects of daily life in Gaza. So the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, according to the court, are all occupied. Is that occupation illegal? Lots of people have argued that the occupation is illegal just because of how long it's gone on for. The court engages with this in a few different ways. It says there's 4 ways in which the occupation is illegal. The first is because it's been going on for so long, almost 57 years now. Occupations are supposed to be temporary. And while there's no hard cap in the law of occupation, it doesn't say you can have an occupation for this long or anything like that. The length of the occupation can suggest that it is illegal if it amounts to territorial acquisition or if it denies the right to self-determination of the occupied peoples. And the court ends up finding in this case that both of those conditions are met here, that Israel is effectively trying to acquire territory by force, which is not permitted in international law, and it's denying the Palestinians the right to self-determination. Israeli settlement policies also violate the law of occupation. I won't go through this in great detail, but I will mention a couple of ways in which the court finds this happening. The first is the transfer of its own civilians into the occupied territory. It is the expropriation of massive amounts of land from Palestinians almost exclusively for the benefit of Israeli civilians. It is exploiting the natural resources in the area, in the occupied Palestinian territories, primarily for the use of Israeli civilians, forcibly displacing massive numbers of the Palestinian population from the occupied Palestinian territories, and of course, committing acts of violence against Palestinians and failing to prevent or punish violence by settlers. So for all these reasons, the settlement policies themselves violate the law of occupation, the court says. On top of this, Israel is seen to be annexing at least part of the occupied territories, that is incorporating it into Israel proper. That is by applying domestic Israeli law throughout East Jerusalem, integrating with the West Jerusalem infrastructure, building a wall on the West Bank. All these things are helping it gain control over occupied territory and helping it pressure Palestinians to leave. Finally, through discriminatory issuances and denials of residence permits, discriminatory restrictions on movement, and practices around the demolition of property, you can see that there is a discrimination happening here that also violates the law of occupation according to the court. That discrimination grounds this claim that many have made that Israel is an apartheid state, and the court has, many have said, the court is claiming that Israel is committing apartheid. So the way to think about this, I think, is to look at Article 3 of the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which prohibits racial segregation and apartheid, right? So it prohibits both of those things. The court, in its decision, doesn't specify one way or the other, whether it's saying Israel is committing racial segregation and also apartheid, or just racial segregation. So the thing to keep in mind here is that the apartheid point is undecided. Individual judges disagree about this. Many lawyers have said there's a strong argument that there is apartheid, but the judges themselves aren't sure that they're all agreeing that there is apartheid being committed here. But there is a comprehensive finding at a minimum of racial segregation, and that's problematic enough on its own. Okay. Having surveyed that and wanting to get into the questions and allow Karen to offer her insights, let me just say a little bit about the legal consequences of these decisions about Israel's presence in the occupied territories. The court says there are consequences for Israel, for other states, including Canada, and for the United Nations. Israel, it says, should end all new settlement activity, repeal all legislation and measures which create or maintain the unlawful situation of Israel's presence in the occupied territories, provide full reparations for damages caused to all persons concerned, including restitution. Other states, including Canada, should wait for the United Nations to determine how to end the illegal presence of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territories. But once those decisions are made, all other member states must cooperate to effect those decisions, to put them into play. But there's an independent obligation that doesn't require any action by the UN for these other states to not recognize any changes in the physical character, the demographic composition, the institutional structure, or the status of the occupied Palestinian territories, except those agreed by Israel and Palestine, and an independent obligation to distinguish in their dealings with Israel, that is, for states to distinguish in their dealings with Israel between the territory of the state of Israel and Palestinian territories occupied since 1967. And that includes taking steps to prevent trade or investment relations that assist in the maintenance of the illegal situation created by Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory. So here, clearly, you don't have an endorsement of BDS wholesale, but there is effectively a requirement for states that deal with Israel to clarify when and where they are dealing with entities and the state of Israel, and when they are dealing with occupied territories, right? And to avoid mixing those two, and to not support and not trade and not invest in anything that supports the illegal situation in the occupied Palestinian territories. Finally, the UN is required to make decisions about how to bring this unlawful presence to an end, to do the same thing about distinguishing in their dealings between the state of Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, and to not recognize as legal the occupation or anything that comes of it. So these are three different sets of directions to Israel, other states, and the United Nations. There's things that we have to wait for. If you're a member state, you have to wait for the UN to do some things, but there are some things that you have to do now on your own, or you should do now on your own without waiting for the UN to get involved. I'll leave it there, and I'm sure Karen has some thoughts on these steps that could be taken and what's happening right now, and I'll let her get into that.
Thank you, Assad, for those comments. That was very clear and I think very helpful for our purposes today. I'll turn things over. Oh, I should have mentioned that this session is being recorded. A link for that will be shared, and you can share that with others as well. So now we will turn it over to Karen Rodman. She is the Executive Director of Just Peace Advocates. She's a longtime human rights advocate and has extensive experience working with civil society organizations and work to advocate with governments to achieve human rights goals. So Karen, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim. And I'm really honored and pleased to be able to join. I want to thank very much the University of Victoria Faculty for Palestine for putting this important event together. And I want to thank Saad for the work that he has done in outlining this and making it so simple to understand, and to help us understand the importance that we appreciate, the weight and the importance of that July 19th World Court opinion and the obligation of the international community and our role as civil society and in that regard. So with that in mind, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the context of Canadian law, because this is fairly Canadian centered, but also and some examples here in Canada that we might want to consider in terms of some of those next steps we could take. So the international community, including the member states and the United Nations, are under obligation to not legally recognize the unlawful presence of Israel in occupied Palestinian territory, nor to render aid or assistance in maintaining the situation according to the opinion advisory. This places the duty of implementing this squarely on the shoulders of the international community. Now, Canada's long-standing foreign policy has concurred that the Israeli settlements are illegal. That said, Canada most often does not seem to follow its own policy, whether it's voting at the United Nations or if it's in its own actions domestically. Regarding the United Nations General Assembly request to the court for this advisory opinion, a record number of over 50 states and international organizations filed briefs giving their perspective on the issue the case raised. This happened a year ago, last summer, where the court received those submissions. This included countries that opposed the court having any jurisdiction or authority over it. Among them, not surprisingly, the United States, the United Kingdom, and others. Canada offered perhaps the most pathetic and embarrassing submission. Specifically, Canada's very brief submission said that Israel had not provided consent to the process, therefore the court should not provide an advisory opinion. Rather than considering the substantial legal issues that were included in the request for an advisory opinion, Canada only suggested that the court opinion would polarize. We can probably drop a link into the chat so you can review more of what Canada said last summer, just to give you the context. In contrast, however, the vast majority of the submissions contended that Israel and Israel's occupation had become illegal and must end completely, unconditionally, and as quickly as possible. The July 24 court opinion aligned with the majority of these sentiments, as we just heard from Assad. It's likely that lawyers in foreign affairs departments across the world are focused on what this advisory opinion means. And in the case of Canada and probably some other Western states, they may be trying to figure out the minimum they can do to appear to be ready to take some action under this new nexus, especially as the UN moves with its next steps. It is not that Canadian law, though, is not already in place. It is. Customary international law is part of Canadian law, specifically the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court and the War Crimes and Crimes Against Humanity Act. And like all member states of the United Nations and high contracting parties to the Geneva Conventions, Canada does have legal responsibilities to ensure in all circumstances that all states live by and enforce the laws and rules which govern international humanitarian law and international criminal law. The obligation is embedded in Canadian law with, I think it's the exact same wording through the common Article 1 of the Geneva Conventions Act. Thus, Canada does have binding legal obligations, both under Canadian and international law, to do everything reasonable and possible to end relationships which aid and assist war crimes. And certainly the court advisory opinion would take this to a new level. So specific actions that can be called for now can be framed within the structural changes or structural understanding introduced by the advisory opinion from the World Court. Society does need to take the lead as states do move slowly. I'm just going to outline a few examples of campaigns, actions, research that have been, they're not necessarily new or haven't emerged just because of the advisory opinion last month, but that do, I think, position well for consideration of some of the things that we can do for civil society moving forward. One would be to call for withdrawing from the Canada Free Trade Agreement for its failure to exclude preferential entry into Canada and the Canadian market of goods and services from Israeli settlements, both in occupied Palestine, but also in the occupied Syrian Golan. There's also been some call and movement, it would be much harder to do, but to look at legislation that would actually be put in place that would make that law for not just Palestine and Golan, but for any occupied areas. Other states have done that, like Ireland. Explicitly, and second point would be explicitly ending all charitable, private, institutional, and other donations, funding, and support for illegal Israeli settlements and for any Israeli political, military, or economic activity supporting war crimes, but we maybe could add apartheid and now potentially genocide because of the separate interim decision of the World Court related to the South African submission. Certainly an example of this and our taxpayer dollars being used to subsidize this is through Canadian charities, and a little bit of movement this past week with the revocation of a couple of charities, Canadian charities that have involvement in the occupation. Another would be ending in Canada the sale and leasing of any properties or enterprises that are in the illegal Israeli settlements. One that I'm sure most of you have been following is military embargo, and that would be imposing what I would say is a three-way military embargo in that it would end import, export, and the transport of military equipment and weapons and components that are associated with the military occupation. A couple of others: stopping illegal military recruiting. The Attorney General has had it on the desk since 2020 with an official application in that regard. And also now in the context of people, Canadian citizens that are serving in the Israeli military, steps to hold them accountable for any acts of war crimes or potentially genocide that they might commit. There was legal cases that have already been put forward over this year, including around military exports, but also a legal case putting the Prime Minister and several cabinet ministers on notice of intent to prosecute under various venues. So that would be another area. And then, of course, sanctioning of all Israeli political, military, and administrative leaders whose official roles and decision-making contribute to war crimes. Canada took a couple of steps, adding some individuals and organizations through 2 rounds of sanctions related to settlers over May and June. So as I end, I also want to speak very briefly to what the advisory opinion said regarding apartheid and the naming of the occupation as illegal. Regarding our apartheid, Assad has already spoken to that, and it's certainly significant that the court held Israel's occupation has systemically discriminated against Palestinians, amounting to racial segregation. I do expect that Palestinian and international civil society organizations will press for their case to reestablish the United Nations Special Committee Against Apartheid that was in place at the time of South Africa. So just as I wrap up by clearly stating that the illegal occupation is illegal, focus is put on the full settler colonial enterprise. It points out to the difficulty in differentiating where the war crimes actually stop and where they would start and where they stop, because the economy, the banking, the military, the whole apartheid system are integrated, sustaining the occupation across all of historic Palestine. No longer can Oslo be used as a rationale for security or some mythical peace process, and no longer is the end of the occupation dependent on subservient occupied Palestinian people having to negotiate a solution with an aggressive occupier that's been acting in bad faith over 57 years. The language of apartheid, illegal occupation, and war crimes are now grounded in this World Court advisory decision. And so while we do wait to see what the United Nations will do next in terms of unwinding the occupation and reparations, this advisory opinion undoubtedly, as former United Nations Rapporteur Michael Link recently said, has put the wind in the sails of these movements and states seeking to increase the cost on Israel for its serial violations of international law and for denying Palestinians their self-determination. So I think the question that is for us is, what does this mean in terms of our response from civil society, from all of us? Along with the items that have been mentioned around government and others, it also means that the boycott and divestments of companies complicit with war crimes, apartheid, and genocide becomes not just a right, but maybe even an obligation. It means holding our governments, institutions, and companies accountable for their complicity with war crimes. That is up to us, all of us, as civil society. We have failed to stop the ongoing NAPCA for 76 years and the horrors of this genocide for now almost a year. But over the last year, many new supporters have taken to the street and social media, learning more about the situation, bringing their expertise, and looking for ways to engage. I feel the World Court ruling provides a fundamental cornerstone to this work, and I look forward to our discussion in that regard.
Thank you very much, Karen, for your comments as well. And I appreciate both of you keeping them relatively brief given the complexity and of the concerns and the context here. So we have about 25 minutes remaining, and what I'd like to do is to proceed into some questions. I think the focus that I've seen in the chat and in the Q&A questions very much goes in the direction of how do we best work for liberation to support the Palestinian people in their struggles. And so with that in mind, I think one point, this is a struggle that's continued for over 76 years. This advisory opinion is one moment in that struggle, and an important one with perhaps great potential. And the question then becomes, how do we turn that potential into material change, into something concrete for the benefit of the Palestinian people? So with that focus, my first question is as follows to both of our panelists. What can we learn from the aftermath of previous ICJ advisory opinions with respect to how to use them most effectively in advocacy and activism work? In the past, what has been most successful in this effort, and what made that successful? If our panelists could address that, thank you.
Sure, I can offer some thoughts on what helps and what doesn't help. I guess the first thing I would say is that if you are looking at an advisory opinion and you're trying to make it effective, because Again, it doesn't automatically directly bind states because they haven't agreed to this process. It's kind of an indirect route, usually through the United Nations. What works and what doesn't work? What you need, first of all, I think, is actually a decision like this one that is really clear in terms of its conclusions about the law. There have been other advisory opinions, one about nuclear weapons in particular, one about Kosovo's declaration of independence, where the court really didn't answer the question one way or the other. Is it legal to have or possess or use nuclear weapons in any circumstance? Is Kosovo's declaration of independence legal? They kind of danced around conclusions on both of those issues. And it made it really hard for states to then turn and say, okay, we now have some clear legal direction or obligation coming from the International Court of Justice. And it made it really hard for civil society to organize and say, okay, this is our anchoring point over here. So you need something like this to start with. What you then need, I think, is some degree of consistent decision making. And so I think what this means is you need to strategically take that decision and turn to a variety of different sources and try and get that decision more concretized in law. So in the Chagos archipelago opinion, Mauritius took the ICJ advisory opinion and then went to the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea to try and get a confirmation about whether Chagos should be part of Mauritius or not, the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission to get these kinds of confirmations. And all this led to some pressure on the United Kingdom to start negotiating the status of the Chagos Islands. Now, that still hasn't been resolved. It's been 5 years, but it's led to some kind of movement and some kind of pressuring. So going to other legal fora, I think, helps. But I think what you need to do is really look for the spaces in which domestically you can start to activate pressure with these really clear legal ideas. And what seems to work is turning to those smaller micro level sites to try and exert pressure on individual states to comply with the opinion. And Karen's been involved with a bunch of this kind of work.
Thank you so much, Asad. And I certainly, in terms of commenting on the previous opinions, I'm not sure that I could add anything. Certainly, there will, within the Palestinian and solidarity communities, be disappointment over the long wait since the 2014 or 2004 decision around the wall. So it is important to be able to move forward. Although even out of that, that's how the boycott, divestment, and movements and sanctions movement happened the following year. So it is also that engagement and moving forward. Maybe just in the context of Canada, you know, I'll mention that in the fall of 2019, Canada did vote for the first time around the one resolution at the United Nations General Assembly for self-determination for the Palestinian people. It was kind of like a crumb that was provided. That crumb really was based on the upcoming bid for the United Nations Security Council seat, and Canada wanting to secure that seat. They had lost it a few years before on the question around Israel and Palestine. They've continued to vote for that one small resolution each of the years since 2019. But by engaging both with civil society, not just on Palestine issue, but on other Canadian foreign affairs issues, we were able to, with civil society and working directly with other member states around the world, really expose and bring a light, at least shine a light on Canada's policy, foreign affairs policy. And we'll never really know for sure, but it seemed that led to Canada not securing that Security Council seat the following year. Canada is in a similar position right now because they've got, their bid, they're positioning for a Human Rights Council seat at the United Nations in a couple of years. And they were hoping that coming out of the last Universal Periodic Review, which is a cycle that all countries go through if you're a member state at the UN, and Canada's just come through theirs, that would position Canada well in terms of its own domestic domestic policy around human rights. But interestingly enough, just a few weeks into the genocide on Gaza, it was sort of mid-November, when our Attorney General and his team was in Geneva and member states had a chance to comment. At least a dozen states made comment around Canada's pathetic stance or concerning stance around Gaza. So, you know, the eyes of the world are back also not on implementing this, you know, totally, but also how that impacts on member state like Canada, and sort of being able to shine that light on the situation and our own foreign policy. So there are lots of examples where we're engaging. The examples that I tried to outline are work that's kind of underway that will position. Some of it's very much based on sort of occupation and the war crimes related to the Geneva Convention, but others move forward into a broader movement towards Palestinian liberation with, you know, full boycott and divestment calls and things that would be further along that path. So yeah, learning from those lessons, but also you know, taking it maybe a bit further in terms of the steps that civil society can play, and then looking to lawyers and academics and others who can you know, guide in terms of legislation, legal cases, and other things that will start to make those differences as well.
Thank you to you both. And so I want to continue with this concern about what is most effective at this time and ways to use this advisory opinion. And so in any social justice struggle, it's highly contextual. What are the points of greatest success or moving things forward? I think both of you may have touched upon this already, but I did want to make sure that we fully canvass this. And so I have a question about if there are some very particular specific aspects of our current context, either internationally or domestically here in Canada, that are most conducive to using the advisory opinion to work for justice for the Palestinian people. And if there are some particularly important aspects of the struggle at this time or the context, what are those and how do we use them? I'll ask you both that question.
Maybe I could pick up just around an example around divestment. So certainly we have seen and saw at University of Victoria the work that's happened both in terms of the encampment, but also I'm sure work in the back room that I won't necessarily know about, of trying to influence and work with administration and board or others. And that's been the same across many universities in Canada and the US and elsewhere. And so that divestment work, I mean, ties very directly to the complicity with war crimes, because a good part of the focus of the call for divestments are companies that are already on the United Nations database as companies that are complicit in war crimes, and other trusted sources like whoprofits.org and American Friends Service Committee Investigate, which tracks those investments and those companies. So like there's an example where it's sort of brought out and met on the street, but there's other work happening. Some of it, of course, is research and getting the details, trying to get disclosure, which is very, very difficult to do. But if we were to take that sort of to another step with a Quebec-based example, work that our organization and others have done for 3 or 4 years has been around a number of public pensions where there is disclosure, and the local community and coming out of the student encampments in Quebec grabbed the analysis for the Quebec public pension, and also a Montreal-based transnational company, engineering company, WSP Global, which has been the project manager for the East Jerusalem or the Jerusalem light rail, which basically has been entrenching colonization of the occupied territory for a lot of years, but somehow didn't end up on the United Nations list. So there's been work that has been done since 2020 with formal submission from Al-Haq, the Palestinian human rights group, and our group to the United Nations to outline a case for adding that company That company has big holdings in the Quebec pension plan. So by bringing those pieces together and new people engaging, lawyers who have taken this on, other groups that wouldn't have maybe a year or two to try to talk to and influence people, and people actually out on the street, and getting media coverage and those sorts of things, that has really pulled that together. And certainly the framework of this advisory opinion, along with what is already Canadian law and international law, does, I think, give the pinnings to say that this, there's an obligation to do this, because these are companies and investments that are completely complicit with war crimes and are well documented. So there are lots of different examples, but how to move that work forward, I guess, is what I'm bringing forward with that particular example.
Thank you. I have a further question, and this might be more for you, Assad. In your comments, you noted that the legal consequences of the opinion apply to Israel, to other states, and also to the UN, and that the UN itself could stipulate further responsibilities of states. That is something I had not been aware of, and I'm wondering if you regard that as an important focus of work, of whether or not, what would be the consequence of the UN making those sorts of directions, the extent to which those will be followed by the member nations, and if that is an important focal point for advocacy work.
Yeah, absolutely. So the court was really specific in a lot of directions it gave to Israel and to other UN member states, but not incredibly specific in terms of its recommendation of legal consequences for the United Nations, right? So there's a bunch of paragraphs for each of Israel, for the other UN member states. But when it comes to legal consequences for the UN, the court says, look, it's for this organization to figure out how to direct the end of the occupation. And so it hasn't given a lot of clarity, a lot of direction, other than this is the goal that has to be obtained somehow. And so there's a ton of space there for different states to have different approaches to this, and for civil society to get involved and say, this, we think, is the best way for you to approach this, right? Given what the court has said about the legality of the occupation and about the illegality of the various practices that are happening within the occupation, we think this is the way in which the UN should approach the question of Israeli withdrawals. It could be timelines, it could be characteristics of the withdrawal, it could be what things are prioritized, it could be recommendations about trade and sanctions, or whatever it may be. Anything is effectively on the table here. The court is very careful to not direct in that sense, I think. So there's a lot of scope there.
And Karen, I didn't want to foreclose your comments. Did you have anything to add to that?
No, I think I just would leave with what Assad has said. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. So we have about 10 minutes left of further time to take up questions. And so there's a few that have been coming up in the chat that maybe we could, the Q&A that we have been receiving here. And I'm not too sure if any of these are for our panelists would like to speak to those specifically, if you think there's something that's particularly important to address.
There's maybe two that I saw that I'd like to pick up on, and then I think there's some bigger picture ones that maybe we can discuss more collectively. One was about the stealing of resources and how that factors into the occupied issue. And the other was about the difference between racial segregation and apartheid. And I'll try and answer those pretty briefly. So this question about how does stealing resources factor into the occupied issue? So when you're an occupier, you're allowed to use resources in the territory that are necessary for your military forces that are there maintaining the occupation, right? What you cannot be doing is depriving the local population of the ability to sustain themselves, to survive, to feed themselves. And you can't be using those resources to further a separate illegal activity of importing your own civilian population into the occupation. into the occupied territories. And that is what the court says Israel has been doing here. And it makes some very strong comments about the range of ways in which these natural resources are being used by Israel in violation of the law of occupation and in violation of the principle of permanent sovereignty over natural resources, which applies to all peoples as part of self-determination. And so there's really strong comments there about that, including how water in particular, both the quantity and quality of water to which Palestinians have access is well below the levels recommended by the World Health Organization, right? So just focusing on water resources, which are highly contested in the West Bank and in Gaza as well, you can see the way in which this is a problem. So it matters to assessing the legality of the occupation and the way in which the occupation is violating different laws. The second question about the distinction between racial segregation and apartheid is such a good question. And unfortunately, I have a not good answer for you. The reason I have a not good answer for you is because the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination of all forms of racial discrimination doesn't actually address the difference. It just says racial segregation and apartheid are prohibited. This is Article 3 of that convention. Apartheid is a species of racial segregation. It is understood, I think, as a concentrated form, a harshened form of segregation with additional extra domination, the artificial declaration of or assignment of racial categories, and part of like a really coordinated and all-encompassing public policy. Racial segregation doesn't have to be apartheid. It can be in one or two different areas. It can be kind of discombobulated, but they are both related to one another. When we think about them, we think of apartheid as being maybe a worse or exacerbated form of racial segregation. But racial segregation on its own is basically implicit or explicit discrimination or exclusion based on someone's race from one or a variety of different public areas.
Thank you, Assad. Thank you so much. And Karen, were there any particular questions in the Q&A that you wanted to address?
I noticed a few, it's not maybe so much a question, Tim, but I noticed people, wanting to mobilize a little bit or work on different campaigns. I see a couple of people from the US saying that they're interested in the work around the revocation of charities, others around the broader boycott, divestment, and sanctions work. So I think what I could offer is I'm glad to put my email into the chat and glad to connect on some of those more specific items and make some networks and connections for people if they'd like to do that. Certainly we are on the charities working with folks on the ground in Palestine with their work and research and their campaigns, but also in the UK and have been doing some outreach in the US and other places. So there are, I think, those networks and connections are really important as we do this work, have the research, and sometimes it is getting a lot of the work ready and being ready at the right moment in the right venues to be able to bring that forward, as well as the more on the street, out there kind of campaigns, which are about education and raising awareness, as well as the pressure that does come forward to our governments, institutions, and to businesses and companies. So just those would be more general comments I'd make for folks in terms of engaging.
Thank you. All right. And I know that we do have an international audience as well, which is wonderful to have. We need that kind of international collaboration to achieve the goals that we need to achieve. With respect to my apologies, but with respect to our Canadian context, with respect to sort of the domestic politics in Canada, are there particular focal points for that work at this time? I'm not too sure, Karen or Assad, if you have any comments about, for those of us in Canada, what would be the most effective forms of advocacy, given that obviously there isn't just one most effective approach. Big question.
I'm maybe not the best person to answer that in terms of advocacy, other than I think Karen's point about this is ongoing work that has to happen, not just at times of acute international attention to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or to the legality of the occupation. I think that it has to be, even when tensions seem low in Israel and Palestine, you need to have attention to these issues, right? Because part of what the ICJ decision is getting at is these kind of ordinary day-to-day things that don't make the headlines, that aren't on the news every day for years and for months and months on end. This is the deeply illegal stuff, right? The stuff in Gaza is absolutely horrific and absolutely criminal. There's no doubt about that. And that's the stuff that grabs everyone's attention. But in between those wars in Gaza, right, and this is the sixth war, I believe, in Gaza since Israel has withdrawn in 2005, in between those wars, there's all this settlement activity that's taking place. And so if we only pay attention when the wars are happening, we're missing something that's actually an ongoing issue. And Karen has alluded to the ways in which Canada has been punished internationally for its weak position in foreign policy in these ways. I think we have to be attentive to that. Be attentive, I think, also to interrelated issues, right? And so I think it's impossible to think about these kinds of strategies without thinking about, the position of Indigenous peoples in this country, their arguments about sovereignty, including permanent sovereignty over natural resources, without thinking about how we think of immigrants and immigration. Those things, I think, are inseparable from this. And in part, the way in which the UN human rights system views Canada is through the lens of its position on immigrants and on Indigenous people in particular, right? And anti-Black racism by police and in jail systems. So all this stuff links together. If you want to exert concerted pressure on Canada, politically, I think you have to think about all of these issues at the same time. And so I think when you're thinking about advocating for Palestine, you're also thinking about doing advocacy work for others. And if you're doing advocacy work for Indigenous peoples, for Black people in this country, for immigrants in this country, you are also doing advocacy work for Palestinians.
Thank you, Asad, for those extremely important observations about the interconnected nature of the justice work across internationally within countries as well. Thank you. Karen, anything to add to that?
I mean, Asad said it so well. I mean, one place people could keep sort of their eyes open, and I'm not sure if we'll get the link in right now, but we'll share it with material after. But the Universal Periodic Review of Canada's Human Rights, which is really focused very much on, for any country, the domestic situation, but more than it has been in the past. I mean, it's really brought the interconnection from both civil society and submissions that we in civil society have made to the United Nations in that regard, but from the other member states, and showing the divide between the global south and the global north in terms of expectations. So to look at that and consider that, and to consider that in light of Canada's plans for a Human Rights Council seat would be just one way on that venue to do that. But yeah, it is exactly as Asad said. It's not a one issue by any means. It's really the whole package.
Thank you so much. I notice that we are at time, so perhaps it's time to draw this to a close. In light of that, I'd like to say many thanks, especially to all of those who participated in the webinar today. I thank you for that, and I also thank you for all of the efforts that you're making in so many ways. Clearly, the Q&A and the chat have revealed sort of deep connections that people have and ongoing work. Thanks, Basma, for introducing the session today, and you were kind of the key organizer to make this happen, so my thanks for that. Karen, you handled the technology so well. This has gone smoothly, and I thank you and Just Peace Advocates for doing the Zoom hosting of the session. And in particular, Asad and Karen, many thanks for taking time to take us deeper into this really important moment and this advisory opinion, and assisting us with the knowledge and your expertise to guide us in the work that we will continue to do. So many thanks, everyone. And as I mentioned earlier, the recording will be shared, and please share that with anyone else who might be interested in learning about this opinion and its potential for advancing the rights and the welfare of the Palestinian people in their struggle. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tim, for shepherding us through this the hour. Really appreciate it. And thanks to everyone for coming and all the great questions. Sorry we couldn't answer all of them, but we're really grateful for your attendance, and we'll try and respond to these questions, if not now, down the road for sure. Very grateful.
For sure. Thanks, everyone. Goodbye all. Goodbye all.